Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome at the Thank you. This is probably the hardest part of the conference, to get you all seated. Welcome at the Gala dinner of the Annual Forum 2000 conference. In the beginning, let me just introduce you to the program of the evening. I'll be very brief. This evening is organized in cooperation with our partner, Prague Freedom Foundation, and Mr. Todoroki. So I thank them very much for their participation. We have had an excellent cooperation with them, and I look forward to further cooperation in the future. This evening is dedicated to our former director, long-term colleague, Olda Černý. We will mention him in several remarks. In the first part, he will be remembered by the chairman of our board, Tomáš Vrba. He will be remembered by Stoessinger, our guest from New York. He'll be also remembered by Mr. Schwarz, the head of Czech Foreign Intelligence Service, who is a successor of Olda in this job. Then we will also have the pleasure of welcoming Congressman Mica, and we will have a pleasure to welcoming our keynote speaker of tonight, famous Cuban blogger Yoani Sánchez, whom we are very happy to have here. Also, we have tried for a number of years bringing her to Prague, and we are happy that it finally happened. So now we will give you a moment. You can enjoy the first course, and we will start with the program in a few minutes. So enjoy the evening.
Welcome, Excellencies. Speaking about Excellencies, I've just learned that His Excellency Norman Eisen, the ambassador of the US, has to leave us earlier, so I'd like to thank him very much for his support to the Forum 2000 conference. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. Everybody knows that without Václav Havel there would be no Forum 2000. But much less people know that there was another man without whom Forum 2000 would hardly work. He was a quasi-invisible, discreet director, the quiet driving force, gentle but decisive power that made things to move, that made conferences, Forum 2000 happen. I speak about Olda Černý, the executive director of Forum 2000, who left us, unfortunately, 18 months ago. We miss him as we miss Václav Havel, and we have decided to dedicate this evening to his memory. You have found in front of you on your table a booklet speaking shortly about who Olda Černý was. It's actually a sample of a larger book about Olda now being prepared by his former colleagues from two important institutions. You'll find in the booklet a handful of Olda's photos with his beautiful, shy smile. Here you have one example with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You'll find there some personal remembrances as well as basic facts. But tonight we have among us people, special guests who knew Olda much longer than I did. Caroline Stoessinger, who met Olda in early 90s when he was preparing his first presidential visit of Václav Havel to the US. She met him and they became friends immediately. And not longer after that, Caroline became the friend and an important supporter of Forum 2000 conferences. Dear Caroline, may I invite you to give you the floor.
Thank you. Olda Czerny's life, his entire life, was a testament to the power and meaning of boundless friendship. For 21 years and 3 months, I was privileged to call Olda Czerny my friend. Early in 1990 in Prague, I casually mentioned to Olda that I would really like to visit the Czech countryside. He said, no problem, I'll arrange it. Called my hotel and said, tomorrow morning be ready early. A taxi driver by the name of Mr. Balser will pick you up. You're driving to Lidice for a few moments, on to Carlsbad, the spa town, where you will have lunch, and then proceed to Marienbad near the German border, where you will spend the night. I've made the hotel arrangements for both of you. During the day, I began to question the sanity of this excursion. My thoughts turned to my only child waiting for me to return to New York City, and I called Olda again. It is the only time I ever heard anger in his voice when I spoke. I said, Olda, is it safe? Is it safe for me to go off on this trip alone? And he said, safe? You ask me, is it safe? Vladimir Balser is my friend. Brilliantly educated and instinctively politically astute, Olda was modest, good-humored, unselfish. Never once did I hear him say, I can't, I'm tired, it's impossible. Turning his talent for listening and observing minute details into high art, he became Havel's Director of International Security. In other words, he was the top spy, armed only with his legions of friends around the world. Olda was the kind of man who could walk equally with presidents, kings, and every man. As a child, I desperately wanted to be an actress. But not even Steven Spielberg could have offered a role that would have been as rewarding as the bit part I chanced to play in the years of Havel's presidency. And I must thank Olda Czerny for all those years. Olda was the man who made things happen. Olda was the man to call. He was always there in the background, producing every scene, including freeing the Czech embassy in Yemen when it was under siege by terrorists. Olda was the first person to call that awful morning of 9/11. His father, a survivor of Buchenwald, returned to Prague after the war, only to be arrested by the communists, imprisoned, and there perished at their hands. He was raised alone by his mother, grounded in traditional moral and ethical values. Olda was incorruptible. The communists tried several times to draft him for their secretive work, but no amount of money, no harassment, and no perks could tempt him. Instead, he chose to eke out a living, writing children's books and dubbing American and British films into Czech. From the vantage point of this elegant dinner, it's nearly impossible to imagine what life was like under the communists. In 1972, I visited Soviet-controlled Prague. Fear was palpable in the gray, bleak atmosphere. The shops were empty. All was surreal. Prague Castle's gardens were deserted. Mozart's theater was hidden behind rusty scaffolding. You rarely saw anyone walking on Charles Bridge. The spy microphones in my hotel room, the Alcorn, were visible. The return trip by train to Vienna was slow, and we were stopped for hours on the Czech side of the border. Young soldiers with machine guns boarded that train and searched each compartment one by one as others walked on top of the train. I watched helplessly as several victims were dragged off into the unknown. Then, in November of 1989, Olda drove to Havel's country cottage in the mountains to deliver a message. The revolution has begun. The impossible dream might become a reality. Yet in New York, we watched tearfully on television as we saw the protesters. We saw the members of the Actors Union holding hands, single line, snaking through the snowy streets. Someone, a political scientist in my living room, said, "Oh, this is awful. Those poor people, they will be jailed or worse." But they prevailed. The revolution was successful. Olda was so happy to explain our revolution was called Velvet because no one was killed, no shots were fired, and no one was even jailed. Olda and I first met by phone in late 1989 when Havel appointed him liaison to me for the New York visit and tribute. He called, "You must come for a meeting with the president. Can you bring some fax paper?" The castle has a fax machine, but no paper. Olda met my flight, ushered me into a huge black limousine. As he climbed behind the steering wheel, he said, "I commandeered this from our former communist president and party boss, Mr. Husak," and he grinned his quixotic smile. Waiting for President Havel to arrive for our first meeting, I was astonished to see men, it seemed they were dressed in painters' uniforms, white coveralls, t-shirts, scurrying up and down those immense corridors on what appeared to be children's scooters. Laughing, Olda explained they were ministers of state. Another day, the staff was scurrying to find a tie for Havel to wear as he watched out the window when President Bush's car arrived in the courtyard. I felt as if Tom Paine were running all over Prague Castle. I mentioned this to Olda. It seems like a replay of the early days of the American Revolution. And he said, "Yes, but don't worry. Bureaucrats are very patient people. They will be back." During that first New York trip, Olda, among his other duties, was in charge of a live television broadcast to Prague, and somehow the satellite wasn't working. The cathedral where the program was filmed was filled to capacity, 10,000 people, many actors. It was incredible, from Placido Domingo to Paul Newman to Paul Simon. People like Carly Simon and Michael Douglas were in standing room. As you see, not all of Olda's activities were cloak and dagger. One of his most unlikely jobs was saving the life, literally saving the life, of actor Gregory Peck. He had come to the famous Kalavivari Film Festival to accept the Lifetime Achievement Award, wasn't feeling well, suddenly diagnosed with appendicitis, and at 82 needed an emergency appendectomy. Who do you call? It's the middle of the night. Olda, Czerny, of course. He found a surgeon in his country cottage, woke him. asked him to rush to the hospital. The surgeon did. Olda was scrubbed and waiting in the operating arena for the doctor to translate in case it should be necessary. Peck returned to Prague twice more to thank Dr. Kubin and Olda Czerny for giving him his life. Václav Havel and Olda were very close friends. And during the last year of both their lives, they spent a great deal of time together. Looking through old correspondence, original correspondence and original drafts of papers, Havel would pull out a sheet and thrust it at Olda and say, "I think you wrote this, didn't you?" And Olda would say, no, I think that's yours. Another paper, "But I wrote this, didn't I?" "No," Olda would say, "I wrote it." And they would enjoy a hearty laugh. Havel gave Olda one of his prized possessions. It was an autographed photograph of President Tomáš Masaryk with his son, Jan Masaryk. That framed memento hung on the wall in Olda's office opposite his desk. And in that last year also, Havel wanted to film his own play, which was called Leaving, his last play, and invited Olda to play an extra role. They really enjoyed themselves. Although Olda had surgery for lung cancer, followed by chemotherapy in the spring of 2011, he was far more concerned for Havel than he was for himself. The Dalai Lama had been planning to attend Forum 2000 last year, 2012, and Olda asked him to come as soon as possible to see his friend if he wanted to see him again in this lifetime. The Dalai Lama responded. The date was set December 10th, 2011. Olda, always thinking ahead, had also prepared a helicopter to take the Dalai Lama to Havel's mountain retreat if necessary. But Havel rallied and came to Prague, and he and Havel sat with Olda close by for an hour talking, the Dalai Lama massaging Olda's hand. As he was leaving, the Dalai Lama said to the president, "I really need you to stay around for another 10 years, my friend." But when Olda walked him outside the building, he said, I don't think he's going to make it or be with us next week. Even on what was to be Olda's last trip to New York, he was full of plans and ideas for the future of Forum 2000. Not only did he not complain about the gravity of his illness or even hint of his impending not to be, Olda roamed the streets of New York, walking miles as usual. He even went shopping for presents for his grandchildren. After returning to Prague, he continued to work and plan for Forum 2000 as if all were normal. He had time for his friends and his grandchildren. Olda was never too busy for friends. Always thinking of others, his last telephone conversations with me were immense gifts of concerned friendship. He helped me, he wanted to help me with my book. He read the manuscript more than once, making corrections that were important. Olda Czerny did not have time to stop for death, but death stopped Olda. While the spirit of our modern 21st century seems to reject the idea of learning from the past, Olda disagreed and cautioned us to remember President Havel's observations. The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart and in human responsibility. Most of us in this room have a great debt of gratitude to Olda Czerny. Literally, he is irreplaceable. Our world is a far more lonely and impoverished place without him. Olda was a noble soul, the kind of man Thomas Jefferson called an aristocrat of the spirit. Thank you, Olda.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard beautiful words by Caroline Stoessinger, but as I've suggested earlier, Forum 2000 was not the first institution where Olda served as a discreet, gentle driving force. If you look at his short biography, you will find that he started after 1989 as the National Security Advisor to President Václav Havel, and shortly after that he was nominated the first Director General of Czech Foreign Intelligence Service. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to the actual Director of Czech Intelligence Service, Mr. Ivo Schwarz. Please.
So, vážená paní Heleno, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say I am truly honored that I was invited to speak here and share my memories of Olda Černý. I would like to thank everybody who organized this gathering, which will allow me to travel back in time. Looking at the situation, I see it fits to use one of the phrases from the President Václav Havel play, The Audience. What a paradox, isn't it? A director of one of the intelligence services of the Czech Republic is now standing in front of you, and Olda Černý, one of my predecessors, was not only one of the co-founders of the Democratic Intelligence Service in this country, but he was also one of the fathers of the idea behind this gathering of extraordinary individuals from around the world. One could say that this must be a result of an intelligence plot. However, it is a true story, fully illustrating the motto of this year's Forum 2000, which is Societies in Transition, and we are speaking about transition. I'm sure that Olda, while translating James Grady's 6 Days of the Condor into Czech in 1980s, would not in his wildest dreams have imagined becoming a member of the intelligence community and, what is even worse, a director of an intelligence service. But it was actually Olda's great sense for democracy and freedom, which was one of the elementary attributes for creating a completely new intelligence service within the new Czech Republic. That was what allowed the service to become an important part of the domestic and also foreign intelligence communities. It was Olda's leadership which brought my service into the grand world of intelligence services. However, the beginnings of Olda's intelligence career was not easy. His own recollection of one of his first meetings with the then Minister of Foreign Affairs is legendary. Shortly after assuming his office, Olda realized that he was heading an organization which was not represented abroad, nor did it have any relationship with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He therefore asked the Minister of Foreign Affairs for a meeting, and at this meeting he was promised a fast resolution of the problem. And surely enough, the solution was found. Fast indeed. The very same day the Minister of Foreign Affairs asked the Minister of Interior for removed Olda from the office, Olda, of course, offered his resignation immediately, but his resignation was not accepted. Thanks to his enthusiasm and his empathy, the whole case was brought to a happy ending, and in the end, the minister became the very close friend of Olda. Even later on, Olda's task in communicating with the Czech political representation wasn't easy. I'm pretty sure one day the researchers will find in the archives unopened envelopes with all intelligence releases marked unsolicited mail. This was how papers from our service returned to Olda from Strakovka, the cabinet office. I missed Olda in the service by several months. I met him personally when he became my informal advisor. His opinions, observation, and contacts were priceless. He came every time when asked. He was always open to any discussion. He never refused a meeting. But one thing I will never forget, he came always late. To conclude, I must say it is my honor for me to be heading a service which is standing on firm foundation laid down by Olda Černý. He was one of the people who led the Czech intelligence service on the path to become a respected institution protecting the interests of democratic country. And I am very sorry, Olda will not come here tonight. Also, I am sure that if he did, he would have not made it on time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry, I have to make this noise again, but please, I would like to ask, especially the tables in the back, to please remain quiet because the acoustics in this room is not perfect and every word is heard in the center, so please, if you remain quiet during the speeches. And now we have the pleasure of welcoming here the wife of Olda Černý. She was not on the program, she was not planned, but she spontaneously decided to join us, so I would like to invite Helena Kašperová to join us.
Good evening. My English is not good, and that's why I'll say a few words in Czech, and Jakub will be so kind and translate it. Thank you. Dobrý večer. Chtěla bych poděkovat Fóru 2000 za uspořádání tohoto setkání a vzpomínku na Oldu. Chci poděkovat předřečníkům, kteří o Oldovi moc hezky mluvili. Ale děkuji i těm, kteří tu nemluvili, ale vím, že si občas na Oldu vzpomenou. Olda byl takové světýlko a já doufám, že bude ještě dlouho svítit. Při vší skromnosti musím uznat, že si to Olda zaslouží. Thank you.
So, a translation of that. I would like to thank all those of you who have already spoken for their thoughts of Olda. And I would also like to thank you to those who didn't speak, because I know that all of you are thinking about him. Olda was such a bright light in the lives of all of us. And let us hope that his light continues to shine for us for many years. In all modesty, I must say that this is the least Olda deserves.
I can still hear some folks here, and I will tell you, when the others were speaking, it was very difficult to hear. So I hope everybody, particularly for our very special guest, will be real quiet. But I just want to say, first and foremost, isn't it great to be in Prague? Isn't it? There is not a time that I've been here that I haven't enjoyed it, your warm hospitality. I would say citizens of Prague and concerned citizens of the world, thank you for being here, because your presence says something about you and what you believe in. And first, I'd like to also thank Jakub and Forum 2000. I was just talking with your chairman and hearing more about the history and the great work you do. And about Václav Havel, I remember when he addressed the Congress many years ago, sincerity and passion flowed from him, and even in his absence, you can feel it. Ambassador Eisen, are you still here? Thank you for joining us. The host country, the Czech Republic. And I was telling someone at our table, my family actually have Austro-Hungarian heritage on the passports of our grandparents in 1900. Although they're Slavic, I just found out in the last few weeks that I have a cousin that lives here near Prague, a third cousin. So we have relatives here, so we're all family. And it is great to be here. But one of the reasons I'm up here, one is to introduce our very, very special guest this evening, but also to thank the sponsors, and I've worked with the Prague Freedom Foundation. Their goals and the goals of Forum 2000 are nearly identical. And we thank you for allowing us to be here. The Prague Freedom Foundation is sponsoring this dinner. The gentleman who's the visionary for the Prague Freedom Foundation, John Todoroki. John, if you raise your hand, thank you for sponsoring the dinner. Where's John? Right here. And the Prague Freedom Foundation found its genesis and was inspired by what we found here in Prague, and of course Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which is part of our country's involvement in your community. The president, Kevin Close, has been a close friend of mine since we moved the radios from Munich to Prague 20 plus years ago. Kevin, are you here? Thank you for all your work, and thank you for participating. If it weren't for Kevin, the radios, I'm not sure how much would have developed for the Prague Freedom Foundation, for the International Media Foundation that we're working with. And I just say thank you for allowing us to be here. My job is not to be the speaker. My job is to say hello. And thank you again, the Prague Freedom Foundation, Forum 2000. And just, they asked me to make a brief comment. And after all these wonderful speeches, I'm not sure what else I can say. But I would tell you this. Just in my days here, and I was on a panel this morning, saw the Dalai Lama, listened to the words of the very, very capable folks here. Prague has become, in the time that I've known it, an intellectual cauldron of political leadership. It brings citizens from around the world to have good, solid, deep discussions about problems we all care about. And what are those problems? Human rights. We're concerned about human rights. Education. Across the board, education is so important. We're not going to solve the problems of this world without a greater effort in the kind of education that you all engage in. You talk about ideas, you educate one another, and you go back and bring it to your communities and educate each other. And we are, and Radio Free Europe, Forum 2000, Prague Freedom Foundation, we are public advocates for democracy, for free journalism. And just today I heard more about some journalists who were detained, others who've been attacked and beaten. It goes on all over the world. Our work is not done. And I know you care about it, we care about it, so we have a great deal to do. But there are some in the United States who are saying, we don't need the radios anymore. We don't need this. The Cold War is over. Just the opposite is true. And I just say this. I've watched with great horror and concern what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in countries around this country. There is and continues to be a tradition among those who oppose everything we believe in to use force, hatred, and violence to maintain their control and their view. And this may be a little bit controversial when I say this, but I believe it. I was a very, very strong advocate of a strong military in the United States. But I do believe that all the armies in the world can't solve the problems that we're talking about here today. It can't be done with weapons, it can't be done with force, or it can't be done with drones, because the battle is not physical. The battle is for the hearts and minds of young people, of people around the world. And that's what you're aiming it for. You know, this young girl just in the last year who was shot in the head for speaking out about women's rights, about freedom. A platoon, an entire army couldn't have stopped that. But what will stop that and will change that is the work of Forum 2000, Prague Freedom Foundation, educational, informational, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, changing attitudes. As a young congressman, I got to know Ronald Reagan very well. One day he was facing a very severe problem, and just happenstance, circumstance, I was at the White House. We had lunch, and we ended up walking out of his office together, and I was very impressed, very young. He put his arm on my shoulder and he said, you know, I'm going to give a speech to the nation tomorrow, and the problem's bigger than I can solve. So what I'm going to do first, and he was a great communicator, what I'm going to do first is try to change the way people think. I will talk about the problem and why we need to think differently. And when they think differently, they will act differently. And that's what this is all about. Let me just close by saying, we have a great singer in America. I love to sing, if you'd like me to sing for you a little bit. Barbara Streisand, anybody heard of Barbara Streisand? I'm gonna do Barbara Streisand. You know, no? She had a great song called People Who Like People. People who like people are the luckiest people in the world. Let me change that. People who care about people are the luckiest people in the world, and that's you. I congratulate you, I commend you, and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And now, our guest speaker. I watched during dinner a blogger tweet. Yoani had her phone out, and I asked how many view her tweet, and she pulled it up, and it said 521,000 at the start of dinner. And I think it's up to 600,000 since we finished dinner here. It's been going off all through the dinner. Yoani, it's all yours. Thank you very much, Ms. Sanchez.
Hola, buenas noches.
Good evening, everybody.
Hace ya más de una década cayó en mis manos por primera vez el libro de Václav Havel, El poder de los sin poder. Venía forrado con una página del periódico oficial de mi país, el diario del Partido Comunista de Cuba.
Over a decade ago, the book by Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless, got into my hands for the first time. It was wrapped in a page of the official newspaper of my country, the daily published by the Communist Party of Cuba.
Forrar los libros era una de las tantas formas en que escondíamos de la vista de informantes y policías políticos los textos incómodos y prohibidos por el gobierno. De esa manera, habíamos estado leyendo en el clandestinaje las historias de lo sucedido con la caída del muro de Berlín, el fin de la Unión Soviética, la transformación checa y todos los otros sucesos de Europa del Este.
Wrapping books into paper was one of the many ways of hiding uncomfortable texts forbidden by the government from the sight of informers and political police officers. We were reading in secret about the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, the Czech transformation, and all the other things that occurred in Eastern Europe.
Sabíamos de todas esas transiciones, algunas más traumáticas, otras más exitosas, y muchos soñábamos con que la transición llegaría pronto a nuestra isla en el Caribe, sometida por más de 5 décadas a un totalitarismo. Pero las transiciones más que añorarlas, hay que construirlas. Los procesos de cambios no llegan solos. Los ciudadanos tienen que provocarlos.
We learned of all those transitions, some of them more traumatic, others more successful. And many of us were dreaming that transition would soon come to our island in the Caribbean, subjected to a totalitarian regime for over 5 decades. However, rather than long for a transition, it is necessary to build one. The processes of change do not come by themselves. There must be people behind them.
Hoy estoy aquí, justo en la ciudad donde nació Václav Havel, ese hombre que resume como pocos el espíritu de la transición.
And today I'm here in the city where Václav Havel was born, the man who embodies, like few people do, the spirit of transition.
Estoy además frente a muchas personas que han impulsado, fomentado y personificado el deseo de cambio de sus respectivas sociedades, porque la búsqueda de horizontes de mayor libertad es un componente esencial de la naturaleza humana. Por eso se vuelven tan retorcidos y antinaturales esos regímenes que intentan perpetuarse sobre sus pueblos y movilizarlos, quitarles el deseo de soñar con que el futuro deberá ser mejor, ¿no?
What is more, I'm standing in front of people who have driven, supported, and personified the desire for change of their societies. Because search for horizons of greater freedom is an essential component of human nature. And this is why regimes that try to prevail forever, immobilizing their people and depriving them of the desire to dream about a better future, are so twisted and anti-natural.
En la época que les correspondió a Václav Havel, a Lech Walesa y a tantos otros disidentes de los regímenes comunistas, fueron efectivos los métodos de la lucha pacífica, sindical, hasta la creación artística se puso en función del cambio.
At the time of Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, and many other dissidents of the communist regimes, methods of fight that were peaceful and trade union-based were used efficiently. Even artistic creation became a vehicle of change.
Ahora ha venido a nuestro auxilio la tecnología. Cada vez que utilizo un teléfono móvil para denunciar un arresto o escribo en mi blog sobre la difícil situación de tantas familias cubanas, pienso cómo habría ayudado estos artilugios de teclas y pantallas a los activistas de décadas anteriores.
Nowadays, technology is here to help us. Every time I use a mobile phone to report an arrest, or I write on my blog about the difficult situation of so many Cuban families, it makes me think how much these gadgets, all these buttons and screens, would have helped the activists of previous decades.
¿Cuán lejos hubieran podido llegar sus voces y proyectos de haber contado con las redes sociales y todo el ciberespacio que hoy se abre ante nuestros ojos? La web 2.0 ha sido, sin dudas, un impulso para ese espíritu de transición que habita en el interior de todos nosotros.
How much further their voices and plans would have reached if they had access to social networks and the entire cyberspace that is opening now before our eyes. Web 2.0 has been, without any doubt, an impulse for the spirit of transition that dwells inside all of us.
Hoy estoy aquí, estamos aquí, por primera vez en el Fórum 2000, una pequeña representación de activistas cubanos.
Today, for the first time, there is a small representation of Cuban activists present at Forum 2000.
Después de décadas de encierro insular en el que el régimen de nuestro país impedía a disidentes, periodistas independientes, activistas y bloggers alternativos viajar al extranjero, hemos logrado la pequeña victoria de que nos abran el cerrojo de las fronteras nacionales. Es una victoria limitada, incompleta, porque todavía nos faltan muchas otras.
After decades of enclosure, where the regime of our country made it impossible for many dissidents, independent journalists, activists and bloggers to travel abroad, we won a little victory, and they opened the borders for us. It is a limited and incomplete victory, because there are many others still missing.
La libertad de asociación, el respeto a la libre opinión, la capacidad de elegir por nosotros mismos a quienes nos representen, el fin de esos actos de odio llamados mítines de repudio que aún persisten en las calles cubanas contra los que piensan diferente a la ideología en el poder. Sin embargo, muchos sentimos que Cuba está en transición. Una transición que está ocurriendo de la manera más irreversible y aleccionadora, desde el interior del individuo, en la conciencia del pueblo.
The freedom of association, the freedom of opinion and expression, the possibility to elect freely our representatives, an end to those acts of hatred, the so-called condemnation meetings, which are attacks organized by the government against those whose thinking is not in line with the ruling ideology. However, many of us feel that Cuba is in transition, a transition that is happening in the most irreversible and authentic manner, from the inside of the individual, the conscience of a nation.
En esa transición habrán influido muchos de ustedes que han llegado primero a la libertad y han comprobado que no es el final del camino, sino que la libertad trae nuevos problemas, nuevas responsabilidades, nuevos retos.
Many of you will have influenced this transition. Many of you who have reached freedom and have seen that it's not the end of the route, but that freedom brings new problems, new responsibilities, and new challenges.
Ustedes, que en sus respectivos países mantuvieron vivo el aliento del cambio, incluso poniendo en riesgo sus nombres y sus vidas, ¿no?
You, who in your countries maintained alive a desire for change, even if it meant putting at risk your name and your life.
Como el espíritu de la transición contenido en aquel libro de Václav Havel, forrado para enmascararlo, con las páginas de los periódicos oficial más inmovilistas y reaccionarios que puedan imaginar, como aquel libro, la transición puede prohibirse, censurarse, ser decretada casi como una mala palabra, postergarse y satanizarse, pero siempre, siempre llegará.
Same as the spirit of transition contained in that book by Václav Havel, wrapped in order to be disguised in the pages of the official newspaper that is the most resistant to change and reactionary that you can imagine. Same as that book, the transition can be forbidden, it can be censored, it can be labeled as a dirty word, it can be put off and condemned as Satan's work, but it will always come.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Yoani. And before I finally let you go and enjoy your meal, over the past couple of days and in the 2 more days to go, you have seen and you will see still the work of the entire Forum 2000 team. And I've heard from many of you that you were very happy, you were very appreciative. And so please just let me take a moment to thank all of them, or most of them, by their names. I would very much like to thank my colleagues, Zuzana Blahutová, Elena Sabová, it's going to be longer, Monika Světlíková, Lea Zahradníková, Filip Šebek, Kamila Šepková, Tereza Šritrová, Jana Hulvejová, Andrea Svobodová, Jan Hornát, and Lucie Strolena, and I can't name all of them, but please check your brochures. You have entire team there, and I would like to ask you to join me in a round of applause for them, because they have done a great job. So thank you, and see you tomorrow.